Welcome to our plenary session number 3. But before we start, I have a brief announcement. I have to say that Karen was the best announcer ever in our European group. Remember, I miss her announcements. And I remember telling her once, but if you don't have any announcement today, why don't you just say, well, today we don't have any announcement, and make the announcement. So, because I love to hear, anyway. The announcement is that the parallel session will not start at 4 o'clock, as it says inside the program, but at 15:30, 3:30. This is the announcement we have to make. So remember the next parallel sessions. And now I can introduce Steve Toombs, who, as you know, not long ago moved from John Moore University, which takes the name from our member over there, John Moore University in Liverpool, and he moved to the Open University. I know him as, I would describe him as a radical criminologist, if he doesn't mind. His book that he published with Slapper is very important. It's used in many courses in universities across the world. It's a book on corporate crime. He's done a lot of work on these issues. And his latest book, whose title I forget, is on the corporation, and it's co-authored with David White. Am I right? What's the title? It's Corporation...
The Corporate Criminal.
The Corporate Criminal.
Yeah.
Over to you, Steve.
Okay. Well, that was very nice. Thank you, Vincenzo. So I'm going to talk a bit, and in a way it's very predictable, but I'm going to have a slightly different take on surveillance and trends in surveillance, because I'm going to talk about the corporation, which tends to be under-surveyed. That's the basic point I want to make, right? But there is a bit more to it than that, I think. I wanted to start off by saying this work was funded by a charitable trust in England. It's the first time I ever had a research grant, and it'd be the last time I ever had a research grant, right? But it's fucking great to have time not teaching and to generate data and think and play with that stuff. And I want to say thanks to Leverhulme, because they were great funders, and their kind of raison d'etre is that they fund work that no one else will fund. So I was very proud to get a grant from Leverhulme, because it also said to me that nobody else would want to fund my work, right? So, but really, it gave me space to do stuff, and I want to acknowledge that, and I appreciate it. I also want to start with a kind of a semi-apology, right? Which is that to the extent I have an empirical reference point, my reference point is going to be some aspects of enforcement and regulation in Britain. This isn't just lazy kind of British imperialism, thinking that the world starts and ends in Britain. It's not just that, okay? In my defence, just as no one else will ever fund me, I wasn't actually invited to give this plenary. Somebody else was going to do it and dropped out. And I'm a substitute. And it was pretty late notice, so that's my excuse for my laziness. In other words, I'm speaking to something which I already had written in a way, and I didn't prepare for this session in particular. So that's my kind of apology to begin with. In fact, I'm speaking about, this isn't an advert because it's too expensive, no one will ever buy this book, but my newest book comes out next month, and it's called Social Protection After the Crisis, and that's kind of what I have to say today comes from that book. It's coming out in hardback for some ridiculous amount, so no one, it's not a plug because no one will ever buy it, right? So I'll talk a bit about it today, and then we can forget all about it.
We can ask for review copies.
You can ask for review copies, yeah, and then. Smart woman. I want to talk about, or the book focuses empirically on 3 areas of social protection. It looks at the ways in which companies are regulated in the UK in respect of safe food, or what's often called pure food, food safety and hygiene. It looks at various forms of, not various forms of environmental protection, it looks at pollution control specifically. It looks at pollution control, and it looks at occupational health and safety, which is one of the things I've done for many years. 3 pillars or elements of social protection. So it's a bit parochial, but it's not just parochial, because I think that what I have to say may have some kind of wider, it's not original, right? I'm not saying anything original, but at least it may have some wider resonance in terms of thinking about state-corporate relationships, particularly post-2008, particularly in neoliberal political economies, and I understand that there are significant variations within and amongst those. Okay. And I think what I have to say should also force us, and not enough of us do this enough of the time, should also force us to think what is regulation, right? Which is something around which I've worked with Dave and Anna for many years. And obviously I'm going to then say the point of this is to say something a bit different, not different, a bit different around surveillance and security. My story spans about 10 years. I've got empirical data I'll point to in a moment, and the span of that data is from about 2003 to about 2013, looking at trends in enforcement. I'll come to that in a moment. But like any story, there's a backstory, and the backstory is much longer. The backstory is about 200 years ago, to the emergence of something which Alain Soupiot, a French political sociologist, I think, Alain Soupiot has called the social state or the social protection state. And Soupiot documents the emergence of the social protection state, particularly in Western Europe. His focus is particularly on France and Germany, I think. But actually, you can also chart this very easily. You can chart the emergence of a social protection state in Britain as well. This is kind of part of early industrialising capitalism, of course, right? So you have, as far as I know, the first piece of legislation anywhere in the world which attempts to regulate capital, attempts to mitigate the free activities of capital, in this case mostly manufacture. In 1802 we have the Health and Morals of Apprentices Act, which subsequently is the basis for a series of factory acts through the 1830s and 1840s, which of course Marx talked about in Capital with great panache and insight, in my opinion. A significant publication in 1842 by a social reformer, Edwin Chadwick. Chadwick, in many ways very similar to Engels' Conditions of the Working Class in England, which documents the conditions of the working class in Manchester. Chadwick produces this pretty important report on the sanitary conditions of the labouring population, basically saying, no, look, people are fucking dying all over the place, right? When from pollution, from poor water, from poor food, being mangled in factories. And Chadwick's report is the basis for the 1848 Public Health Act. In 1863, we have the Alkali Act, which is the first form of pollution control in Britain. And in 1875, we have the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, which is the basis for legislation designed to ensure what was called then pure food. So food to guarantee, or not guarantee, to make more possible the chance that food would be hygienic and safe to eat. So essentially, what we have is the kind of putting into place of a regulatory regime which tries to mitigate some of the harms produced by capitalist production. And this, of course, happens in other states at other points, right? Just to make some very obvious points here about what was going on, clearly, these regulatory regimes emerged out of struggle. They emerged out of struggle between classes, but they also emerged out of struggle within classes. So there were many classes of employers who actually were quite happy to see their branches of industry regulated. Again, Marx talks about this in Capital. So there was inter and intra-class struggle which produced these regulatory regimes. The second point to make is that these regulatory regimes only became... sorry. All right, calm down, Steve. Only became possible at the point at which a new legal concept was invented, strict liability. So strict liability meant that the law could be applied to mostly factory owners, but that the law would be applied in a way which, if found guilty, employers were not criminalised. Again, something which we talked about in a session in this room yesterday. So the invention of strict liability was crucial in producing regulatory regimes which didn't criminalise employers, didn't criminalise corporations. But of course, that's not to say that these regulatory regimes were completely ineffective. They weren't completely effective. There was certainly some harm mitigation. Yeah. So food was purer. Working conditions were slightly better. And pollution was, to some extent, controlled. by these new forms of regulation. Okay. Now we go back, now we come forward in time, right, to the time period which is the focus of what I want to talk about in particular. 10 years from the mid-2000s onward, mid-2000s onwards. People in this room will mostly know that in 1997, after 18 years of Conservative government, we had a modernised Labour Party come to power. Modernised, in other words, most vestiges of social democracy stripped from it, and is a pro-globalisation, pro-neoliberal party then, which it still is now. Tony Blair was the Labour Prime Minister. 97. In 1998, Tony Blair, and the first time he assumed the presidency of the European Union, chose that moment to make a speech about something which hadn't really been spoken, a phrase which hadn't really been used at this point. He named something called better regulation, put better regulation on the agenda. And in classic Tony Blair, New Labour, neither left nor right speak, Blair says the argument is not the old one, more regulation against less regulation. No, our focus is on getting regulation right. Better regulation. I mean, who could fucking argue about better regulation? Of course, we all want stuff to be better, right? I mean, it's just impossible to argue with this stuff. We'll come back to some of the language in the points from what I have to say. But interestingly, regulation that will improve, not hinder, business competitiveness. So, a regulatory framework which putatively exists to control some aspects of business activity is somehow, under better regulation, going to make business more productive. Yeah? There's a new way of talking about regulation, but actually, in many ways, it's what regulation has always done, which is why, as I said earlier on, there were classes of factory owners who didn't at all object to the early forms of regulation, such as the Factories Acts. Better regulation kind of drops off both the British and European agendas to some extent. It bubbles around, right? But then there's a key moment around 2004, key moment in Britain and a key moment in the European Union, because in 2004, Blair then assumes the presidency of the EU for the second time, right? For a second 6-month period, and uses that period to place better regulation firmly on the European Union agenda. His government had begun to do it at home in Britain through establishing something called the Hampton Review. Hampton reviewed 67 national regulators and 460-something local regulators, and effectively produced a report in 2005 which said there was too much enforcement. That was the bottom line, right? There's 100 pages to say it, but that's really what it said. And Hampton, in a way, is the kind of key policy document in establishing better regulation as a kind of reality, materially and discursively. Blair's presidency and his kind of advocacy of better regulation was also then picked up within 2 or 3 years at the European Union level. So you may or may not remember, but at this point, the Lisbon Protocol was being renegotiated. The Lisbon Protocol, in its first guise, had talked about sustainable economic growth. In its second guise, where the fingerprints of better regulation are all over it, Jan Verheugen, the European Commission Vice President, says the equation is simple. The equation is now simple. Less red tape equals more growth and jobs. Okay? So there's a new way of thinking about regulation which is becoming established during this period. I don't want to talk about better regulation in detail, actually, in terms of its principles, but I would say the key assumptions built into the idea of better regulation are firstly that actually most businesses, for most of the time, are law-abiding in any case. Most businesses comply with the law, right? So we don't really need to worry too much about regulation nor enforcement. We only need to worry about enforcement with those very small number of businesses who may on occasion break the law. And if we target our enforcement resources at those businesses, that's a more effective use of law and regulation, better regulation. But even when we deal with those non-compliant businesses, we should not deal with them as if criminals. We should not deal with them via sanctions. We should deal with them via advice and education. Persuade them to comply at some future point. The other assumption which becomes significant, I mean, you've already seen it in Blair's early 1998 statement, but which becomes significant by 2008, right? Once we've all been fucked up the arse by the banks, right? 2007, 2008, at this point, because apparently states have been overspending, of course they were overspending, right? You know, on feckless people like us through indulgent welfare systems. Private capital very quickly becomes the only way of recovery. Right? Private capital is the only game in town. States have to ensure that private capital do what private capital does best, which is make profits, which benefit all of us, right? Generate economic growth. And at that point then, regulatory reform and less enforcement become even more crucial, because enforcement gets in the way of businesses doing what businesses do best. Businesses do best. Okay. So you have this kind of combination of events, circumstances, and interventions. The last and most obvious thing to say about better regulation, so obvious I'm going to labour it for a while, is that better regulation didn't just kind of appear. I mean, it did appear in a way, but an awful lot of work was undertaken by states, the national state in the UK, local states in the UK, and indeed supranational state organisations like the European Union. An awful lot of work was done, an awful lot of work was undertaken by states to produce the idea and to produce the image that states are withdrawing from regulation. Okay. I'll come back to that point. It sounds, if that doesn't sound sensible, well, who cares in a way, but I'll come back to it, right? And there were four key ways, I think, four key mechanisms by which better regulation was implanted upon populations. And again, my reference point here is Britain. And clearly, you know, these things play out slightly differently in different national contexts. I get that, right? Four key mechanisms. One, and some will be very familiar to you. One was a kind of very long term, but you see this ratchet up about 2004. It's very conscious, right? From Blair and senior politicians down, and through various forms of broadcast and print media. A long-term rhetorical assault on the idea of regulation. Regulation, a new common sense about regulation is being constructed here. And the common sense is that regulation gets in the way. Regulation is bureaucratic. Regulation is red tape. We've seen that phrase already, right? I'd like someone to do a search and find when the term red tape was first used, right? But now we all know what red tape is, right? It's shit stuff. Gets in the way. We laugh at it, don't we? No, actually I don't, right? But regulation during this period becomes seen as something which is anti-entrepreneurial, anti-productive, as burdensome, and as something to be minimised almost at any cost. The second set of things was that in Britain, a whole series of institutions was set up in and around government. These things often came and declined, were superseded very quickly. But they were institutions which sat at all levels of government, and what they were doing was kind of keeping an eye on regulation, keeping an eye on regulation creep. So we had things like the Deregulation Unit, the Deregulation Task Force, the Better Regulation Commission, the Better Regulation Task Force, the Risk Reducing Regulation Committee. There are loads of these things, right? And that they proliferate in and around government. And in and of themselves, they're kind of irrelevant. But the fact that they start to mushroom and still exist, right, is, I think, significant. The third thing that happens is a series of process of legal reform. So some laws do get changed. But this isn't just about deregulation. So some laws are removed and some protections are removed. So, for example, most self-employed workers in the UK now are not covered by health and safety law, are not covered, exempted from it, right? So laws are being removed, but also other laws are being introduced. The one which the very famous one is the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act. It emerges in 2008 to hold large companies which kill to account. Right? Kind of odd because it doesn't really fit. But it kind of does fit because it's only 12 cases ever been taken under that act since it was put in place in 2008. And all of the prosecutions were against small companies, in fact, not large organisations. But it's not just a process of regulation. The other thing which goes on during this period is a whole series of, and continues now, is a whole series of reviews of regulatory agencies and of regulation in general. So all of those 67 national regulators have all been subject to formal reviews, commissions set up in and around government. That's actually quite a lot of fucking red tape, right? Reviewing 67 regulators, but that's what's been happening. The 5 biggest national regulators have to be reviewed every 3 years, and the basis now legally, and the basis of the review is should they be abolished? Okay. So regulation is always under the spotlight, and what this does, of course, I think one of the things it does, is it actually impacts upon the psychology of what we'll come to, psychology of people who work in regulation, right? Because they're all fucking useless. They all get in the way. No one really wants them. They all walk around like little bureaucrats enforcing silly little laws. Right? And this common sense and this continual question, the common sense of regulation as a burden, and this continual questioning through reviews of what should regulators exist, I think has very concrete and very material effects on those people who seek to enforce the law. Not that there are very many of them left. All of this stuff's going on, all of this orchestrated by the state, all of this undertaken by elements of the state at different levels. Within the kind of net effect is the state is claiming to be producing a freer market through better regulation. The state is claiming to be withdrawing, but in fact, its fingerprints are all over the economy, right? And why wouldn't there be? Because there's no such thing as a free market could ever exist, right? As any serious fucking political economist knows that, right? Of course. Anyway. All right, I'm going to shift registers now, and I'm just going to very quickly refer to some data, some quantitative data, over this 10-year period. And it's in these 3 areas of social protection. I'm not interested in particular numbers, right? But basically, for this project and for this book, I generated a massive empirical data about a whole series of indicators of enforcement action. There are actually 5 regulatory bodies involved in these 3 areas. Again, the detail isn't important, I don't think. What's remarkable about that data is that every indicator shows a long-term decline from 2003-4 to 2012-13. Every indicator, and there are about 60 of them. Okay? I've never seen a set of social science data like that, where the trends are all in the same direction. To spare you all of that stuff, I've just picked out 2 ends of the regulatory enforcement continuum. Inspections, when people actually go into workplaces, and prosecutions, the kind of sharp end of regulation. Although there aren't really that very many prosecutions, I'll come to that in a moment. So you can see, for what it's worth, inspections and prosecutions over a 10-year period in respect of food, in some decline. Not considerable, but for example, less than 3/4 the numbers of prosecutions at the end of the period than there were at the start of it. If we then go to health and safety, which is regulated by 2 sets of regulators, a national regulator in some workplaces and local regulators in other workplaces, we find much more significant declines. So, preventative inspections at a local level almost disappeared at the end of this period, almost don't happen. The only time a local inspector goes into a workplace is following an incident, right? And by an incident we usually mean some kind of personal carnage, right? They're much sharper declines. And just to put some of this in context, the health and safety law between these 2 regulators is enforced, it's not enforced, right, but putatively enforced against 2.5 million businesses, right? 2.5 million businesses are kind of caught up in this to some extent. At the end of this period, there are less than 500 prosecutions. Right? You don't have absolute figures here. 2.5 million businesses, 500 prosecutions. The numbers are quite staggering, right? So it's not just that they are in sharp decline, but the absolute numbers are also very small. And again, just to kind of complete the picture in terms of pollution control, again, there's local and national enforcement in this context. There are very, very few prosecutions in any case. Cautions tend to be issued, but they've reduced significantly, and notices tend to be issued as opposed to prosecutions by local pollution control inspectorates. again, the numbers don't matter, right? The trends are the key thing over this period. Pretty stark, I think, and pretty clear. The other thing which I did, as well as generating this quantitative data, was I interviewed inspectors across these these three functions, these 5 regulators. I interviewed 35 inspectors in the context of this piece of work. And you know, there's lots of rich data. There's lots of kind of there are lots of findings from it. I just wanted to point to one or maybe two for the purposes of today. The interviews were conducted. The last interview was conducted at the start of this year, and they were done over about an 18-month period. So we're talking. This is now a snapshot of perceptions of enforcement officers at the end of the period that we're talking about, which is the end of the period indicated by the quantitative data. So it's got a different level of data, of course, but it's also very clear. So at the end of this period, the regulators that I spoke to were almost unanimously clear that they couldn't do their jobs. They couldn't enforce. They had no or almost no enforcement capacity. These are perfectly typical quotations which I've pulled out of the data. And kind of interesting, the ones that these at the bottom are kind of saying, you know, look, the social protection state doesn't really exist anymore. It's kind of what they're saying. They don't talk about the social protection state, but that's really what they're kind of saying. This is starting to get dangerous, a danger of public health. Where we are now, we're at the point of workers' safety is being jeopardised. It's going to come to the point where it's going to affect residents, the local population, public health and public protection is being eroded. Perfectly kind of clear set of data and a very realistic sense of their enforcement capabilities at the end of this period. At the same time, right, after being battered by better regulation for 10 years, there are still people in my sample who kind of think that better regulation hasn't got better enough yet, right? And, you know, it's kind of logical, isn't it? Because if you say something's got to get better, well, it can always get a bit more better, can't it? There's never an end point of better, right? It's not like I want to be 6 foot tall, I just want to be bigger. Fucking hell, great. There's never, I'm never good enough, right? 5'10" would do me, but that's enough of my personal problems, right? So you see, at the end of this period, you still see some regulators, some enforcers. We need to be more business friendly and get our customer focus right. The customer is the company against whom law is supposed to be applied, right? It's very odd, right? Even language. Increasingly, we're told that our main job, back to kind of Blair's 1998, better regulation, right? Encourage efficiency. Increasingly, we're being told our main job is to facilitate business, industry, and so on. And then the third quote was from one of this kind of, well, kind of a not very likeable man who's a head of regulatory services in one authority, Colin. Colin says, I'm in the business of collaborative regulation. There must be growth, and our job must be to support business. Right? Even at the end of this period, our job not to law enforcement doesn't exist in this scenario, right? It's about supporting business. If you look at regulatory services departments nationally and certainly locally, you'll find, or I found, it's not a secret, right? I mean, you just have a look, right? There've been various kind of marketised reforms, and indeed some wholesale privatisation of regulatory services. So there's a big local authority in London which has just subcontracted all of its regulation to Capita, a private company. So subcontracting to a private company the regulation of other private companies, right? Kind of odd, but this elements of marketisation and privatisation are rife through national and local regulators. What you have then is a situation where companies effectively self-regulate, or self-regulate. Regulation is not an issue, right? Okay, this doesn't make sense. It makes sense statistically. The average workplace can now expect to see a health and safety inspector once every 46 years, right? Once every 46 years. If I knew that I could jump on the bus and it would be 46 years' time before somebody said, "Where's your ticket, son?" I'd be doing that every fucking day, right? That's how I would self-regulate. Yeah? So self-regulation is the norm, enforcement virtually doesn't exist, and businesses talk about compliance which they define themselves, right? But isn't overseen. The kind of final nail in the coffin is not the right phrase, but the kind of coup de grace, let's say, pièce de résistance of all this, was a change to the code of conduct effectively, which governs how regulators operate. So all of these regulators, the men and women who work in these 67 national bodies, the men and women who work in these 468 local bodies, the ways in which they go about their business is regulated by a code. That code was rewritten in 2013 to encompass something called the growth duty. And the first line of the code of conduct for regulators says that first and foremost, regulation must support economic growth. It's not about the law, it's not about compliance, right? It's not even about self-regulation, it must support economic growth. Okay, I'm coming to the end, don't worry. It's not long.
10 minutes,
Yeah.
quarter to 3.
Okay. What do we make of all this? We have a very active state on behalf of capital. We don't have deregulation. We don't have anything called a free market, but we do have the state working very hard on behalf of capital in order to change the nature of regulation, or actually I would say to reveal the nature of regulation. Because regulation has never really been about law enforcement. There's been some law enforcement historically, of course, but regulation has never really been about law enforcement, one might say. So, two very different quotations. Gabriel Kolko, who was a political historian, who wrote many very good books, but one Dave reminded me of recently. When Kolko's analysed the emergence of regulatory regimes in New Deal America just after the Great Depression of whatever it was, right? 1910s. And this period is usually seen as a period when the interests of business were tamed by the emergence of new forms of regulatory agencies. And Kolko goes back to that history and reanalyses it and says, look, actually, that's just a wrong interpretation of what was happening. Because businesses were actually quite happy to have some level of regulation, because regulation for them meant state support. In fact, Kolko talks about the institution of something he calls political capitalism in the States at that period. Regulation was pro-capitalist, regulation of a certain kind, as Kolko says. It was never a question of regulation or no regulation, of state control or laissez-faire. There were rather the questions of what kind of regulation and by whom. I won't read it all out, you can all read it, right? But Kolko's analysis of regulatory reform in the United States, okay, there are differences of course, but is a very helpful way of looking at what's been going on under the guise of better regulation. It's wrong to say it's deregulation. There have been elements of deregulation, but deregulation implies a withdrawal of the state, and the state hasn't fucking gone anywhere, right? Of course, we also know that from 2007. Right? The state hasn't gone anywhere. Now, it's not to say that the ideologues of capital don't talk about the state in very particular ways, and no better representation of that class than our Prime Minister David Cameron. And Cameron's very clear. We want to build, he would say, we want to build a leaner, more efficient state. We want to do more with less, right? There was one of the early better regulation documents was called Less is More. Fantastic, right? How is less more? I don't think, but less is more, right? But it's clear that this moment is a key moment for thinking about state-corporate relationships, for thinking about so-called market-polity relationships. And Cameron kind of knows this, right? I think. I don't think Cameron knows this, right? Okay. Now I really am going to stop after this one, right? So, better regulation was first kind of spoken around about 1998, picks up steam in the early 2000s, but 2008 was a key moment in instituting better regulation in the UK, and I also think through institutions of the European Union, because of course private capital was the only game in town for post-2008 recovery. To go back to the kind of conference themes of surveillance and security, well, it's clear that in Britain, and I think in many other economies, capital now compared to 10 years ago is far less surveilled and actually far more secure in its ability to make profits in a relatively untrammeled way. What I've been talking about, as I've emphasised, I think, is not really deregulation. It's a process of re-regulation. I think we misread events if we think this is about, we swallow the neoliberal line, right? If we think this is deregulation, it's re-regulation. The point about that is what's important is if the state can be active in one way, it can of course potentially be active in another way. But the state hasn't gone anywhere, right? The state is always talking about setting capital free, but actually it's more closely imbricated with capital now than it has been certainly the last 30, 40, 50 years, I would say. Okay? So we shouldn't kind of swallow neoliberal illusions. Thanks.
Very good. Thank you for sticking to the time. And now we have about 20 minutes for questions, observations, comments. Please. Yes, Steve?
Thanks for a fascinating talk. I was having a laugh with Anne over lunch about one of my past careers as an emergency planner. We went to a factory outside of Manchester, and on the inspection we found there were two tanks, and one of them had
Speak up, please.
cyanide, the other had hydrochloric acid in. And the outcome of the survey was that if it was breached, there would be 7.5 tons of hydrogen cyanide gas that would kill everything for a mile around it. But right next to it was Manchester City Sports Stadium. So my question is this, because we've seen that massive explosion in Tallinn, it's will a body count change this regulatory framework? So I see today that all the people responsible for that factory in China have now been arrested. And I'm just wondering, because of historically, to do a magnificent historic job, in the old days it was seen as fair play to build dangerous industrial camp next to residential areas. You started to think through about legacy issues and whether that is still the case, because there are working class areas in the industrial north, what's left of them, cheek by jowl, you have working class housing, and really dangerous factories that have not been inspected.
I'm not sure what the question is, Steve.
The question really is there a need to actually review this, not just in Britain, but in Europe, in light of what's happened in Tallinn, the idea of it's a major emergency terrorist security risk to have industrial camps. You don't need to take a bomb into an industrial area, you just into a residential area, you just need to visit the factory. It would have been so easy in the Commonwealth Games, there were 40 heads of state, the Prime Minister and the Queen, within half a square mile of that ticking bomb. And it was really easy to get into that factory. You know, if you could have got in there with the right chemistry down. So I'm just saying, is there a need to reframe this in a time of terror and a time of insecurity?
Well, I don't know is the answer, but what I would say is that the only which wasn't at all clear from what I said, the only remaining relatively effective area of regulation in the UK, both from a kind of health and safety, but also from a pollution point of view, are major hazard sites. So large chemicals installations and nuclear installations. I'm not saying it's a great regulatory framework, but it's the one area of regulation which has kind of survived much of these processes, being kind of taken out of many of these processes. It's the one area of regulation, for example, where there are still, I mean, again, one could say they're inadequate, but there are still levels of inspection, and that there are also actually prosecutions are not really true, but still there's a kind of inspection hasn't declined in the ways that I point to across those areas. And I think, look, I think it's kind of it's not in anyone's interest, right? It's not in capital's interest to fucking blow up, part of the northwest of England. I'm being serious, right? I mean, so it's one of the ways in which regulation kind of is in everybody's, and I mean everybody's interest, I think. And so and that's not even to take on board questions about kind of, national security and so-called terrorism. But just to make the empirical point that one area isn't kind of affected in the ways which I've talked about these areas generally. Yeah.
David White.
What I'm talking about was actually a sub-SEMA site. So the site you're talking about, the so-called SEMA site.
They're SEMA sites, yeah.
But quarter of a mile from my site, which was a sub-SEMA site, was a SEMA site. So if the thing went up, everybody controlling the SEMA site would be killed. So what I'm saying is there's chains of actual risk around this. If what you say is true,
Yeah.
then we're moving into a different era.
Yeah. You may well be right. Yeah. Yeah.
David first, I think.
Steve, can I ask you to make a link to a discussion that we had a bit earlier in a kind of different way? Just because I think it's really important to think about the close connections between what we might call the mainstream criminal justice system here and what you're talking about, particularly for this audience, because the connection is, as was made in the earlier session, that you made with Anna in your work in Finland, that when you criminalise corporations, it's not inconsistent with the decriminalisation of the usual suspects of mainstream criminals or young people, whatever. And of course, in this period that you're talking about is a period where we see the opposite effect, the decriminalisation of corporations and a criminalisation of drug users, homeless people, young people, and a rise in the prison population, and a particular rise in the women's prison population in the UK. So maybe, I don't know if you could just kind of say a bit more about that connection. I'm not trying to say there is a kind of causal link here or anything,
No.
but there clearly is a connection that you could maybe say something about maybe.
Well, okay, I'll answer that in two ways. One is just now the kind of, I think, pretty well established empirical and to some extent conceptual argument, which is that unequal societies are harmful societies, right? So the more unequal societies are on almost any indicator of harm production, then they're more harmful. And that would apply to that would apply as much to criminalising young people, women, surveillance of routine surveillance of kids' activities on the street. Would apply as much to those things as it would to effective decriminalisation of corporations and the legalisation of corporate harm. So that's one way in which I'd reply to that. And the other way is to repeat what I said this morning, which is the point that Anna and I reached in that work, which was, okay, so in Finland towards the end of the last century, there was something emerged called a war on economic crime, corporate and white collar crime. And this is kind of odd, if not unique, right? Because we have wars on lots of things, but we don't have wars on corporate crime, right? So we were digging out, well, we did some work on where this came from. And, as with all of these things, there are a complex of reasons. But one of the claims that we made, which goes back to the point that Dave has just raised, was that Finland was a place, because there was some vestige of an ideology of equality, right? I'm not saying it's any nirvana, that's not the point, right? But it's very different to neoliberal Britain at that point, and probably still now. And the conditions which meant that criminalisation of the usual suspects was not as rampant as in, for example, Britain, were in a sense the same conditions which allowed criminalisation of corporations. Yeah. So it was less criminalisation of the usual suspects, which made more criminalisation of the unusual suspects kind of possible, or there was a relationship, and who knows what it was. It wasn't cause and effect, but I think those things were pretty clear to us at the time. Yeah.
Anne, I think, yeah.
I wonder if you could line this up with what's happening to the police in the UK, because this government has been attacking its own police force, and I'm a bit close to this. One of my family is a police officer in Bradford. His job is now to receive all the reports of incidents in Bradford and cut them by half. So the only ones that they respond to are where there's a vulnerable person involved, defined as vulnerable, or where it involves damage to the reputation of the police. So there are lots of things happening in northern towns which are affecting public safety. There's no preventative stuff going on, just reactive policing, and the police are completely demoralised. And I wonder, how does this match up? Is this because the people who are making those decisions to privatise many of the police functions and bureaucratise them are not affected by this because they have private security guards? But it's all, they live in gated communities and all of that. Or how do I make sense of that theoretically, of what you're saying?
I don't know how you make sense of that, actually, theoretically. I mean, look, there are things that we could say about the ways in which May and Theresa May and the government in general have taken on the police federation, or seem to have taken on the police federation. I mean, there are things, but I'm not sure how to make sense of kind of some of those developments in relation to some of the kind of wider theoretical, not theoretical, but kind of claims that I was making. I'm sure someone smarter than me could do that, right?
That's what I can't piece it all together. If I were in their shoes, what is the logic of doing that? Which is going to create more social exclusion, division, inequality, and obviously is part of that logic, but actually is making their own lives less secure.
Well, maybe someone can help us out.
Okay, Al, I think it's Al and then you, yeah? Pepinski?
In response to that, it cuts the recorded crime rate. And so it makes for a sign of progress that somehow or other the appearance that the community is safer. I was also wondering, is it implicit in the idea of economic growth that it implies growing inequality, both in political and economic power? Isn't that almost by definition the case?
Sorry, I missed the. Can you say that bit again? Sorry.
That growth,
Yep.
by definition, is relative.
Yep.
Some relative to others. Therefore, growth implies growing disparity in wealth and the political power that accompanies it. That is growth.
Well, that's not okay.
Logically implicit.
But there are two things, aren't there? You know, one is the production of surplus, and the other is the relative distribution of the surplus. And the distribution of the surplus does and can change in polities over periods of time, and varies between different varies between different societies. And you know, I would say that's partly or almost entirely an effect of the balance of social forces. But I think that the production of a surplus and the distribution of surplus are two slightly different things, right?
Yes.
Just again, stitching together the bigger picture. Your book is about post-crisis deregulation of capital, arguably in the aim of enhancing capital's growth as the rescue mechanism for the crisis it put us in. Yeah, of course, that connects up with regulation light, doesn't it? Which is the total deregulation of the financial services in the lead up to the financial crisis. So these things are very intimately connected, aren't they? If you go everything from the deregulation of the regulations designed to limit, the nasty side of the banking industry from fucking everyone up the ass, all the way through to the total failure to regulate, say, the shadow banking economy as that group.
Yeah.
I mean, so these things are creating, in this, if you like, back to surveillance. As you take the surveillance off, and you just create a global zone of impunity for capital, which is where we now are.
Yeah. Yeah, look, I don't disagree with much of that. And I mean, look, I think what happened in financial services was a bit different in the sense that there was a very formal moment which was deregulation. I mean, controls were removed in '86 in the big bang of deregulation, and the conditions which then kind of built up to 2007 were in many ways created at that point. So what was interesting to me, though, well, one of the things that was interesting to me was how very obviously the financial crisis, whatever you want to call it, was whatever else it was partly an effect of the level of regulation. Whatever else it was, right? Whatever we don't know about it, we kind of know that. And most people kind of would agree that the level of regulation, or the absence of certain forms of regulation, produce the conditions which allow financial service industry to do, or banks to do what banks did. Right?
I'm just thinking.
But sorry, I'll just then I'll shut up. But re-regulation, or more effective forms of regulation, was only on the political agenda for about 6 months, and then it disappeared. And in fact, by 2010, all three main political parties in the UK went into the general election 2 and a bit years after bailing out the banks, saying there's too much regulation. It was incredible, right? Sorry, I cut you
I
off.
was just thinking this idea from regulation light. When did that turn fiscal? I mean, remember Gordon Brown talking about this early on?
Well, the Hampton Report of 2005, it was around that moment that, and when Brown had set it up as Chancellor, and when Brown referred to it in his budget and said we need light touch regulation. So that was a very explicit use of that phrase. The other interesting thing about that, well, for me, interesting thing about the Hampton Review is that the Financial Services Authority, right, was held up as the model regulator to which all other regulators should seek to emulate. And of course, it's the Financial Services Authority which was fucking asleep under this table while the banks were doing what the banks were doing. So.
Yes, Mary?
Hi, thanks. Following on from that, I mean, if you've got Britain going in one direction, which is deregulation, regulation right, and what have you, at the same time, it's also constructing the great demon of over-regulation, which is Brussels and the European Union. And obviously, are there any comments that you could add to that in terms of situating Britain as either typical or atypical of a trend across Europe? So on the one hand, it's seen as Brussels is seen as the big heavy regulator, and yet, in fact, deregulation is occurring across the European Union.
Yeah, I didn't get this for a while because it's, in a way, and I don't mean to be rude about this, but in a way, I didn't see this point, but in a way, it's very obvious once you say it. It's not the point you just made, right? But the anti-red tape, anti-regulation rhetoric has been more, I'm pretty clear, it's been more virulent in Britain than in any other economy which I know about, right? And I think part of the reason for that is exactly, it's also tied up with an anti-European Union sentiment, which, as you know, is also pretty virulent in our political culture, our recent political culture. So I think in that respect, Britain is probably peculiar in its rhetorical hatred for regulation, because it's also about a rhetorical hatred for the so-called bureaucrats of Brussels, right? I think. So I'm kind of agreeing with you.
Yeah, I mean, and again, the little bit I know about, regulatory structures, a bit of agriculture, which is something I know a tiny little bit about, has been the incredibly selective way in which the British government has decided to regulate to a point of absurdity. And deference imposition of certain kind of regulatory, almost as if to expose the excess of Brussels, and the ludicrous excess of Brussels. This ridiculous regulatory situation has arisen because Brussels is making us do it. And I don't think I'm being conspiratorial here. There's a clear pattern whereby there is a selective over-regulation in certain areas for political reasons which way beyond the need to rationalise regulation across the different nations.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I think one of the clues to that might be that when we think about, in one level there are commonalities about all kinds of regulation, but social regulation, for example, kind of social protection regulation, is often and in many ways quite distinct from market regulation or competition regulation. So I think that some of those points might be bound up in those differences actually.
2 more minutes we've got, so 1 or 2 more questions. Quick, please. Yes?
Yeah, Steve, thanks for that. Just following on from the red tape sort of discussion and discourse, because it reminded me of Jeremy Clarkson for some reason. I kept thinking of as the ultimate sort of spokesperson of the red tape discourse. Is it accompanied by a corresponding emergence of a discourse of individual consumer and worker responsibility, and it is individualising it down, you know, because your responsibility not to have an accident. If you're not having those kind of interventions, as you showed, that sort of decline of, you know, agents actively performing those kind of audits, is there a corresponding individualised discourse that sort of seeks to make people responsible for their own food safety and that kind of
Yeah, very much so. I mean, Clarkson features heavily in my book, by the way.
Oh, God.
No, because I think it's, you know, it's quite important that he's, you know, he reaches a lot of people and
Yeah.
those at that at a particular moment. No, I think there is. I'll give you one instance of that. In 2011, most of you in the room will know, 2011, Mark Duggan, a young black guy in Tottenham, North London, was shot and killed by the police. And there was outbreaks of riots in North London and other towns and cities across England, actually, not just England. 5 people were killed in the 7 days, in the 9 days that followed. And 9 days after Duggan was shot, Cameron makes his first set-piece speech as a response to the riots, right, in Birmingham. And in that speech, he talks about the damage to our fabric done by the health and safety and human rights cultures, which are stopping people taking responsibilities for their own lives. And this is used as a kind of, you know, this is a response to a fucking riots, right? And 5 people are killed, and he's talking about, but it's exactly that kind of link that somehow, you know, what this means is the health and safety culture means we expect the nanny state to look after us, where really we should be looking, and if we were looking after ourselves, we'd be better citizens and not allowing ourselves to be shot by cops in North London, right?
Last question, because we all want some coffee at this point, don't we? So,
Just very quickly, if there have been 90% fewer preventative inspections, has there been an increase in the number of worker health and safety and reportings of harms at work?
Yeah, it's almost impossible to say, Paddy. It's almost the numbers of deaths that formally get recorded in the UK is something like, Dave, help me out here. It's something like 1,100.
Well, I'm using your figures. Right?
Yeah, go on. Don't do that.
If you're talking about death through sudden injury, it's about 6.
Okay.
And if you include occupational health, then it's a tiny fraction.
Yeah. But we know actually, so that's the official data in hundreds, but we know pretty much that there are up to 50,000 deaths a year from occupational health and safety harm, if you like. That's pretty well documented. Even the ILO, the European Union, accept a figure of about 37,000, but it's probably a bit higher than that. So, you know, if you say a few hundred deaths, 50,000, we just really, to map recorded injuries or deaths alongside this data it'd just be a completely waste of time task, I think.
okay, well, join me in thanking this very interesting.